Allen Lund Company has new offices in Ogden, Utah and Indianapolis, Indiana. Check allenlund.com to reach them.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Redding.
One of the most common and easily recognized images in trucking and other freight-moving industries is the humble shipping container. But how did the shipping container come into being? For many years, one name has come up, that of Malcolm McLean, credited in numerous places as the inventor. However, the real story is more complex and a lot more interesting. I'll talk with author and historian Mark Levinson. Also on today's program, several members of Congress have spoken out on the issue of speed limiters, and one of them is Congressman Mike Collins of Georgia. We'll bring you some of his comments from earlier this year on the issue. But first, the news with Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. Our top story today. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is taking the next step toward modernizing its registration process. The agency opening up a 60-day comment period on Wednesday to garner feedback. FMCSA previously announced plans to replace its unified registration system with a new online version named FMCSA Registration. The goal is modernizing it. One result FMCSA hopes is rooting out some of the fraud that has been rampant in recent years. Ken Riddle, director of FMCSA's Office of Registration, said during the agency's safety research forum earlier this year that the new system should close some of the gaps that currently exist.
The fraud mitigation is not going to wait on this new system. We have to implement that as soon as we can. And then when this system is rolled out, we will integrate those new solutions, the fraud-resistant solutions, into the new system. So we're not going to wait on the new system. But at the forefront of this new system will be fraud-resistant security features. The new system will streamline the registration process. It'll be a lot more intuitive and not quite as cumbersome as what our customers and our registrants experience today. It'll be an improved user experience, and it will improve the quality of the data that we collect, which I think everybody in this group will recognize the benefit. We're going to have real-time data validation, smart logic, and edit checks that'll help reduce the errors, the bad data, the mistakes as a registrant fills out the application. And then lastly, it's going to consolidate most all of the forms that we have today into one online system. And that online system will be intuitive so that it won't ask you questions that you don't need to answer. So if you say, I don't carry hazmat, it's not going to ask you a bunch of hazmat questions. It will ask you the next question based on how you answered the previous question.
FMCSA's new registration system is expected to be rolled out later this year or in early 2025. Stay on alert this extended holiday weekend. CargoNet, which specializes in cargo theft prevention and recovery, has issued an advisory warning of the increased risk of criminal theft activity. Dating back 5 years, CargoNet said it's identified concerning patterns between the Thursday before and the Wednesday after Labor Day. The data paints a clear picture. Theft incidents peak on the Friday preceding Labor Day. CargoNet says the trend suggests that loaded conveyances left unattended as workers begin their holiday weekend become prime targets for thieves. The risk is further compounded by the fact that many of these thefts go unnoticed until business resumes after the holiday. CargoNet said theft activity hit record levels in 2022 and maintained that elevated state through 2023. Noteworthy thefts from previous Labor Day holidays include more than $1 million worth of seafood stolen in Sioux City, Iowa, $800,000 in footwear stolen in Memphis, Tennessee, and $713,000 in apparel and accessories stolen in Eastvale, California. Stay vigilant and stay safe out there. The U.S. DOT has announced more than $500 million in grants for more than 50 electric vehicle charging infrastructure projects. The $512 million will go toward projects across 29 states, including the installation of more than 9,000 charging ports. Although all of the projects are for publicly available charging and alternative fueling stations, nearly all of them are in urban or suburban areas, making it unlikely they'll be available for large heavy-duty trucks. That said, one of the largest projects receiving funding does center around zero tailpipe emission trucks. The California DOT will receive more than $100 million for its West Coast Truck Charging and Fueling Corridor project. The project will build charging and hydrogen fueling stations for trucks along 2,500 miles of freight corridors in California, Oregon, and Washington. According to a news release, the number of publicly available EV chargers has doubled under the Biden administration. More than 192,000 charging ports are available, with about 1,000 new chargers installed every week. But according to the Energy Department, less than 400 public charging ports are available for heavy-duty electric trucks, and just 12 of those are fast charging stations, all but 2 of which are in California. For the first time in more than a month, we have new co-sponsors of a bill in the U.S. House that would streamline the security clearance process for truck drivers and others. 2 members of Congress added their names as co-sponsors to the Transportation Security Screening Modernization Act this week, bringing the total to 61. The bipartisan bill is aimed at current TSA policies, which often require separate applications for credentials, like the Transportation Worker Identification Credential and hazardous materials endorsements. That's despite TSA already conducting a security threat assessment for each program. The bill would standardize and streamline the process. 31 House Democrats have signed on as co-sponsors alongside 30 Republicans. There's also a Senate version of the bill, but it's been slower to pick up steam. It currently has 5 co-sponsors. When introduced back in March, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi said it would cut through red tape so workers can get back to moving goods across America, not wasting time and money. A lower speed limit is coming to a stretch of Interstate 70 in Colorado, notorious for deadly crashes. It's in Wheat Ridge within the Denver metropolitan area. The Colorado DOT said it's lowering the speed limit from 60 to 55 miles an hour after a study. New lighted signs will first go up, warning drivers of the change. In a statement to 9 News, the Colorado DOT wrote that speeding is a concern along this and all roads in the state. They urge drivers to heed the speed limit and signs in construction zones and to drive to the conditions on roadways. An historic covered bridge in southern Maine has been closed indefinitely following a collapse. An overweight dump truck filled with crushed gravel is to blame. The Maine DOT said the driver failed to heed the posted weight limit on Babbs Bridge and fell through it and into the Presumscot River below. Fortunately, the driver wasn't seriously hurt, but the company that owned the truck was issued a $2,500 citation. Officials say Babbs Bridge will be closed for several months at least. A traffic alert in eastern Washington state where wildfires have shut down eastbound I-90 and State Route 21 west of Ritzville. The Washington State DOT says the roadway is closed until further notice due to safety concerns. There is no estimated timeline for reopening it. At last check, westbound I-90 in the area is still open, but the state DOT said that could change depending on conditions. For a one-stop shop on all the latest road conditions in Washington state or any other state, head to landline.media, click on the Resources tab, and scroll down to Road Conditions for truckers. And finally, a Massachusetts man just won $2.6 million playing the lottery with the same set of numbers he's been using for 30 years. Kevin Connor told Massachusetts state lottery officials that some of the digits were his wife's landline number when they first started dating. Connor said his winnings will go toward his children's education and buying himself some new socks. That's Landline Now News for today. I'm Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Scott. If you'd like to support the OOIDA Barry Johnston Scholarship, you can donate to the fund. Send tax-deductible donations to OOIDA Foundation, Inc., 1 Northwest OOIDA Drive, Grain Valley, Missouri, 64029. Starting September 12th, Marty Ellis and OOIDA's tour truck, The Spirit of the American Trucker, will be at the Petro in New Paris, Ohio. That's located at Indiana Exit 156B off I-70. Stop in, say hi to Marty, and join OOIDA for a $10 discount. Next, I'll discuss a shipping container pioneer and his connection to trucking with historian and author Mark Levinson. We'll be back in just a moment with more news and information. Please stay with us. I'm Mark Rettig, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
Every year, 28 million people are trafficked globally. The Your Roads, Their Freedom campaign seeks to raise awareness in the transport industry. Truck and bus drivers, be vigilant on the roads. If you see something suspicious, text 233-733 or be free.
Truckdown.com. Whenever you have a breakdown, you need Truckdown.com. 24/7 access to 40,000 verified heavy-duty repair vendors nationwide. Truckdown verified, vendor qualified. Truckdown.com.
Firestone tires are for more of everything, with more durability for more miles and more confidence in your fleet. Firestone's tested tires help fleets save with value where it matters most. Learn more at bridgestonenationalfleet.com/4moremiles.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
One of the most common and easily recognized images in trucking and other freight-moving industries is the humble shipping container. Whether behind a truck on a chassis or stacked high on the deck of a ship, shipping containers are a common sight for anyone who moves freight. But how did the shipping container come into being? You're listening to Landline Now, and I'm your host, Mark Redding. Welcome back to the program. For many years, one name has come up when people think about the origin of shipping containers, that of Malcolm McLean, credited in numerous places, including an entry on Wikipedia, as the inventor. His obituary in the New York Times hedges its bets, listing him as the father of containerization. However, the real story, as is so often true in history, is a little more complex and honestly a lot more interesting. That includes the fact that McLean started his career as a truck driver. One person who knows a lot about shipping containers and Malcolm McLean is author and historian Mark Levinson. He wrote a book titled The Box: How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. I spoke with Levinson recently about Malcolm McLean and his part in history. Well, first, I'm wondering if you could tell us about Malcolm McLean's early life, where he was born, something about his family and his upbringing.
Malcolm McLean was born in Maxton, North Carolina, then quite a small town. And it was a rural area, and his family had a, I think, fairly typical lifestyle of that time. His father had sometimes worked for the post office and sometimes did other things and sometimes farmed to make a living. That was sort of the practice. McLean came of age during the Great Depression. He finished high school, and the question was, what do you do now when jobs are hard to find? And so he originally purchased a truck and was hauling stuff around his neighborhood, hauled gasoline to a gas station not far away, and that sort of thing. During the New Deal, with a lot of federally funded public works, he started hauling stuff on public works projects, got a couple of trucks. And so that's really how he got his beginnings in the 1930s. And then he decided to build a trucking company. His company was called McLean Trucking, and initially it hauled things around North Carolina, and then gradually expanded over a broader area. I've got to inject here that the federal government began to regulate interstate trucking in 1935. So before that time, anybody could be in the trucking business and pretty much go where they wanted across state lines. Many of the states had regulated trucking earlier than that. But after the federal government started to regulate trucking under the Interstate Commerce Commission, then truckers needed to be able to justify their service. They were only allowed to serve approved routes. They needed to prove that the public convenience and necessity, that was the legal terminology, required their service. So you couldn't just start going a new place or carrying a new commodity. The commodities that a truck line could carry had to be approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The rates charged had to be approved by the ICC. And the ICC was very concerned about the stability of the industry. What that meant was that they didn't want anybody coming in, starting up a trucking company or charging unprofitably low rates, because that would drive other truckers out of business. And the ICC thought that it was part of its job to keep the industry stable. So the only way that you could really gain market share as a trucker was to keep your costs lower than other truckers. And McLean really focused on that, developing efficiencies in trucking. He gradually developed routes between the Southeast and the Northeast, New York and New England, carrying textiles, tobacco, different things like that. But he, for example, was very early in striking deals with certain fuel stations along the route. So he could get diesel fuel more cheaply than perhaps other trucking companies can. He had built some innovative terminals early on to reduce the cost of cargo handling. All of this was meant so that he could go to the ICC and ask for lower rates than competitors were charging and prove to the ICC that these rates would still be profitable. And McLean was very successful at this. He built his business to the point that by the early 1950s, McLean Trucking was one of the largest trucking companies in the country.
Now, I was reading in the New York Times obituary for Mr. McLean, and I don't know if you can confirm this or not, but they had mentioned that McLean Trucking was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first to actually use diesel fuel for trucks. Can you tell us something about that?
My understanding is that that's true. Diesel technology was not particularly new, but there was a whole question of how you can make it adaptable for trucks. Can you have the engines big enough to move truckloads of freight? And of course, there's this whole network issue. And nobody is going to want to use diesel fuel unless they can be assured that they can get it where they're going. So McLean was an early buyer of diesel fuel trucks. And for a period of time, I think that gave him an advantage in the marketplace. Obviously, the rest of the industry followed suit before too long.
You mentioned that he continued with McLean Trucking up until the mid-1950s. And it was at that point that many people credit him with, as they put it, the invention of the shipping container. And you were mentioning before we went on air, that's not exactly the truth. Can you kind of explain what his part was in terms of the shipping container economy as we have it today?
Sure. McLean absolutely did not invent the shipping container. Okay, the idea that you should take a lot of small packages and put them into a big box in order to save money in transport costs was not really a new idea with Malcolm McLean. This had been around since the 1700s. You can find drawings of canal boats in the United States where the freight compartment would separate from the rest of the boat and could be moved and put on another canal boat on the other side of the mountain. That sort of thing. By the 1920s, many U.S. railroads were using containers. And in Europe, railroads were using containers. These were typically much smaller than today's containers. But the main thing from the railroad's point of view was that they wanted these to be proprietary. Okay, they didn't want to let their container go to anybody else. So typically, a railroad would set up an arrangement with a truck line to carry a certain kind of container. It would only fit on this railroad's freight cars. It would only fit on this truck line's bed. And so you could ship via container, but you couldn't interchange the container. You couldn't send something from Kansas City to New York, partially on the Missouri Pacific and then partially on the Pennsylvania Railroad. That didn't happen, okay, because everybody figured this was a way to keep the business for themselves. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which I mentioned earlier was the regulator, was not helpful here. The reason was that freight rates were based on commodity, and many shipping containers that were used in the 1930s had several different commodities inside. This was a problem for the ICC because truckers and railroads were not supposed to charge on the basis of a container. They were supposed to charge on what was inside the container. And in fact, the ICC ended up telling the railroad in the first of these cases that went to the commission that this container was a great idea, but if you wanted to use it, the railroad had to open the container, see what was inside, and then that would determine the rate that would be charged for shipping the goods in the container, which rather defeated the purpose of a shipping container. Okay, there was no savings because you had to haul the stuff out from inside and figure out what all was in there. The containers that were used in Europe, they were usually wood containers. Often they were covered with canvas. The European railroads had an international container bureau that tried to promote containers in the 1930s, but it was just of a very small scale by modern standards. And there were some things that really held this up. I mean, imagine you've created a container, whether you've built it out of wood or you've made it out of steel, you put goods in it, you ship them somewhere. What do you do with the container? Okay, if it's wood, you can burn it. If it's metal, you've got to either ship it back empty or find somebody to send something in it or use it as a storage shed, in which case then you have to add the cost of making the container to the cost of the shipment. So all of these things really got into the way. So that gets us back to Malcolm McLean. McLean was not the inventor of the container. McLean was dealing with a problem with his trucking company, which is that after World War II, there was a huge increase in automobile sales in the United States. There were a lot more cars on the road. McLean ran his trucks between the Southeast and the Northeast on roads that were generally not yet turnpikes, not yet limited access highways, and things were slowing down. Okay, there was too much traffic, and so his trucks were taking too long to make this trip. Of course, that raised his costs and affected his rates, and really was bad for business. And so his idea in the early 1950s was, suppose you could just take this truck and put it on a ship. Put it on a ship in New York, sail the ship down the coast to Carolina, take it off ship in Carolina, and it would go to its destination. This was a technology that had actually been used during World War II. It was not a new concept. McLean worked on it for a while, and he realized it didn't really make much sense to put a truck on a ship because there was a lot of waste space. So then he figured out, suppose you detach the cab and just put the chassis with the freight compartment on the ship. And looked at that for a while and then realized, well, you could do that, but then you could only have one layer of containers because you couldn't stack the chassis. And so it developed into this idea that maybe you could just have the back of the truck detachable from the chassis, from the cab, and just ship the container. And that's what he did for the first time in 1956.
You've been listening to a conversation I had with historian and author Mark Levinson, the author of The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. And we've been discussing the so-called father of containerization, Malcolm McLean. When we come back from a short commercial break, I'll talk more with Levinson about how McLean started moving shipping containers by ship in order to solve a problem he was having with his trucking company, as well as how the federal rules for transportation at the time forced him to sell his trucking company in order to get into moving containers by ship. We'll be back in a moment to continue that conversation. I'm Mark Rettig, and this is Landline Now.
Today's rising costs affect everyone. Replace your harmonic damper with a genuine Vibertech TVD viscous damper to prevent costly repairs and downtime. Keep your money in your pocket and your truck on the road with Vibertech TVD. Recommended replacement at 500,000 miles or 15,000 hours.
Ready to make more money? Use a better load board. For a limited time, get 50% off Truckstop Load Board Pro. Just go to truckstop.com/go and enter promo code READY2024 when you purchase Load Board Pro.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
Landline Now, welcome back. Before the break, I was talking with historian and author Mark Levinson, the author of The Box: How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. And the topic of our conversation was the so-called father of containerization, Malcolm McLean, the man who revolutionized freight movement by putting containers on ships in a way that they could also be hauled by truck or rail. Levinson was talking about how McLean came up with the idea for using shipping containers on trucks and freight ships by trying to solve a problem he was having with his trucking company. We now continue that conversation in progress.
So the container start was really quite prosaic. Okay, Malcolm McLean was trying to avoid traffic jams because they were hurting the profitability of his company. So subsequently, there's been a lot of stuff about how he was setting out to change the world and so on and so forth. And that's not true at all. He was trying to solve a very concrete problem that his company was facing.
So is it accurate to say that because of what he did in order to solve this problem for himself, did that lead to the standardization of shipping containers that we have today?
Well, so McLean, I should tell people, was forced to sell his truck line in order to make use of containers. The Interstate Commerce Commission frowned upon companies owning different types of transportation. That was a no-no. So he could be in the trucking business, but not then also in the domestic shipping business. And so finally, he decided to take a big bet. He sold his company, McLean Trucking, made a good bit of money on it, and plowed it all into this untested technology, which was the shipping container. He started originally in 1956 with 33-foot containers, because that was the biggest size that could be attached to a truck to go on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And then he switched to 35-foot containers. There were a bunch of imitators. There were other companies that started container service. Matson Line used containers between the Pacific coast and Hawaii. They did really careful stuff on that. A 35-foot container would be too heavy. Their biggest cargo was canned pineapple from Hawaii, and that a 35-foot container of canned pineapple would be too heavy for a crane to lift. So they came up with 20-foot long containers. And there was another company that had 17-foot containers and so forth. The ships in that day were often financed by the U.S. government. And the trade-off was that the government had the right to demand the use of these ships in times of war. And so we had here the Military Sealift Command coming to the shipping industry and the rail industry and the trucking industry saying, what are we supposed to do with this? If we have a war, we get to commandeer all these ships. But some of these ships are going to take 17-foot containers, and some of them are going to take 35-foot containers, and some are going to take 20-foot containers. And how can we run a war like that? And so that set off a process of negotiating standards, first in the United States and then internationally. And this process went on for almost a decade. It started in the late 1950s. And I tell people that the guys who negotiated this stuff were, in a way, the heroes of the shipping container story. Because you have to imagine spending 10 years sitting in smoke-filled rooms talking about how thick the end wall of a container should be. And that's what we're talking about. It's not just the size of the container that needed to be standardized. It was, for example, how many supports should there be inside the container? Okay. That's not very important to, say, truckers because they're only carrying a single container. If you've got a ship, that's really important because you may want to stack containers several high, and so they've got to be really strong. So the interests of the different parties involved in this were very different. And it took a lot of negotiating before there was an agreement on what today is the standard 40-foot container.
Okay. Why do you think it is that Malcolm McLean's name figures so prominently in this story, that he is credited, however inaccurately, with inventing the shipping container? What was it about him that kind of made that the narrative, you think?
Well, people like a good story. And I think Malcolm McLean did remarkable things here. Okay, just invention was not what he did with the shipping container. What he did was really find a way to make this rather old technology financially viable. Okay, people had experimented with this for a long time and had never figured out a way to make any money out of it. Really, McLean's greatest contribution, in my view, was what he taught the industry that we now refer to as logistics. He, coming into the maritime industry from a background as a trucker, he said to people, nobody cares about your ship. Nobody cares about your train or your truck. People are interested in getting their cargo from here to there on time as cheaply as possible. And so forget about all the romance of the sea, forget about the romance of the rails, focus on your customer. And today, that doesn't seem so important, but you have to put yourself back in the regulated environment of the mid-1950s, when trucks were trucks and trains were trains and ships were ships, and these were totally separate businesses in the eyes of the industry, in the eyes of the regulator, in the eyes of Congress. They didn't have much to do with each other. And McLean said, this is not how you serve your customers. And that's a substantial accomplishment. I mean, retrospectively, looking back today, you really can't appreciate how much that has changed the way that the logistics industry does business.
Now, as I understand it, when he started his work with shipping containers, he bought, as you mentioned, he sold his trucking company. He went into this, and his first ship was an old World War II tanker. And I'm kind of curious, can you tell us something about that? What gave him the idea of maybe a ship that would be set up specifically to haul large numbers of these containers?
Well, so he had this concept of putting freight into a container. He was willing to bet his own money on it. In those days, there were a lot of leftover ships from World War II that belonged to the U.S. government. These were, people will have heard of Liberty ships. Many of these were Liberty ships. There were hundreds of T2 tankers left over. These were fairly small tankers that were meant to ferry gasoline or oil across the Atlantic. So McLean was able to buy two of these tankers at very little cost. And he had his people put a frame above the deck of the tanker called a spar deck. And this frame was meant to hold 58 containers. That was the initial attempt. Why? Well, partially the tankers were available. Partially, if this container thing didn't work out, he could always transport oil in the tankers. So that's the first container ship was a converted tanker, which carried 58 33-foot containers. By today's standards, an extremely small load. But that was okay because remember that the rest of the infrastructure needed to handle containers really didn't exist either. So the containers were lifted onto this ship by just an old-fashioned whirly crane. Okay, nothing like the accuracy of a modern container crane that can load a container every 30 seconds. So they couldn't have handled a large ship. It was just, the whole technology was not there. There were not a lot of ports that were set up to handle containers. I mean, there was a whole evolution that had to occur here before the container could be widely used.
Following this, this was when he purchased, as I understand it, a company called Pan Atlantic Steamship Company, changed the name to Sealand. but he eventually sold that, as I understand it, to R.J. Reynolds. What happened with McLean after that?
Well, so McLean had bought Pan Atlantic because he needed operating rights. And again, to take you back into the 1950s, you couldn't just travel between here and there. You couldn't, if you wanted to run a ship between these 2 points on the U.S. coast, you needed permission from the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the easiest way to get it was to purchase a company that already had it. And so that's why he purchased Pan Atlantic Steamship, and then he later purchased Waterman Steamship. Same reason initially. This was really dictated by regulation, and so he changed the name to Sealand Service and built this company. It was the largest container shipping line in the world, which did not mean a whole lot in the 1950s and early 1960s because there were not that many containers around. But this business grew and it became a solid business only after standardization. Okay, once there was an agreement on the standard size, then companies started building larger ships to travel the Atlantic. That's when container shipping started to become an international business. And McLean himself introduced containers, persuaded the military to try container ships to supply troops during the Vietnam War. So that's at the point at which this really became a big international business. And McLean had run it for a good number of years. R.J. Reynolds, it's a cigarette company, tobacco company. It spun off lots of money. It wanted to expand into other things. And the container shipping industry, people thought, was it going to be a go-go industry? I mean, there were other go-go industries at the time. Your older listeners will remember, when Xerox was a go-go company, and there were some others. And so here was this idea. So they spent a lot of money. They bought Sealand Service. McLean stayed with R.J. Reynolds for a while. He hated it. He was not really a corporate guy. He didn't want to deal with somebody else's corporate bureaucracy. And R.J. Reynolds decided after a while that this was not a terrific fit because this wasn't like Xerox. This was really a commodity business. And the loads were determined really by the state of the world economy. And so it was very cyclical. Rates climbed, it was very profitable, then rates crashed, and all of a sudden it was losing money hand over fist. And by the way, that's when you needed to explain to your shareholders why you were buying new ships, even though rates were really low and you were losing a ton of money. And so they eventually decided they didn't want to be in the container shipping business either.
Now, McLean went on. I know that he briefly took over another shipping company, which didn't make it. But then in 1992, and now we're almost 60 years after he started in trucking, he founded a company called Trailer Bridge. Is this something in the same business, or what can you tell us about that company?
Well, yeah. So McLean, personality-wise, McLean was a guy who loved the competition part of business. Okay, he didn't need to make another dollar. He had plenty of money, but after he sold his company to R.J. Reynolds, he got bored. He wanted to be in the game. He wanted to be doing things. He bought United States Lines, which was the biggest U.S. flag shipping lines, an international carrier, wanted to build its container business, made some bad bets. He was not the first and he was not the last to make bad bets on container shipping. And eventually U.S. Lines went bankrupt in the late 1980s. It was at the time the biggest bankruptcy in U.S. history.
You've been listening to a conversation I had with historian and author Mark Levinson, the author of The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. And we've been discussing the so-called father of containerization, Malcolm McLean. We'll be back with the rest of that conversation after a short commercial break. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Penske owns and operates some of the best-maintained vehicles on the planet. Our used trucks come with a 5-year maintenance report and pre-sale inspection. So if you're in the market for a top-quality pre-owned truck, look no further. Search our inventory today at PenskeUsedTrucks.com.
Control your toll costs and eliminate tolling headaches with Prepass Tolls. Prepass Tolls means toll volume discounts. Just one invoice for all tolls and fewer violations. Call 877-878-5970 or go to prepass.com.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com, because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
Landline Now, welcome back. Before the break, I was talking with historian and author Mark Levinson, the author of The Box: How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. And our topic is the so-called father of containerization, Malcolm McLean, the man who revolutionized freight movement by putting containers on ships in a way that they could also be hauled by truck or rail. Before the break, Levinson was discussing what McLean did after selling his first shipping company to R.J. Reynolds, eventually purchasing the biggest U.S. shipping line, a venture that didn't work out for him as the company went bankrupt. We now continue that conversation in progress.
And McLean he was very ashamed of this because a lot of people had lost their jobs and he felt responsible for all of this. And so he kind of isolated himself for a while and then got enticed to come back into business with this company called Trailer Bridge, which was running containers basically between Florida and Puerto Rico. So it's a much smaller company, a company that sometimes was profitable, sometimes not, but he just needed to be engaged. This was not somebody, at this point in time, he was not young and he could easily have retired, but this was not him. He needed to be in there competing. In my book, The Box, which is the story of the container, I have a quote from someone who worked with him, who made the comment to me that you couldn't go quail hunting with Malcolm without betting on who was going to have the first, the most, the biggest. And that was a very insightful comment because that's how this guy was. He was just competitive and he wanted to be in the game. And so that's how he ended up back in the business at an age when he really didn't need to be in business at all.
Well, that's all I have. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, obviously, the container shipping business has changed a lot since Malcolm McLean's day. Back then, it was initially just a domestic business, and then it started on a fairly small scale. No one really could have envisioned the extent to which containers would come into use. Now the heart of globalization, and no one envisioned that. No one also could have envisioned that this 40-foot container would become in many ways obsolete. There's a phenomenon here that economists refer to as lock-in, and that is when you get a certain technology, everybody's using that technology and it's not so easy to use another one. And that's the case with the 40-foot container. There were reasons that became the international standard in the 1960s. But now every country in the world just about has limited access highways. In many cases, the roads are wider than they used to be, and the trucking regulations have changed so you can carry a longer trailer. And that's why in the United States, we have this rather bizarre practice of bringing freight into the country in 40-foot containers, and then in some cases at terminals near the ports, taking the freight out of 40-foot containers and stuffing it into 53-foot containers so that truckers can carry it over the road. If there had been more foresight back in the 1950s and 60s, perhaps we would have started out with 53-foot containers, but that's not what we've got. So that's why a lot of the containers on U.S. highways today are 53 feet long, but the containers moving over the oceans are 40 feet long.
Well, sir, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful story, and I'm glad we're helping helping you set the record straight on the legacy of Malcolm McLean.
People love a good story like that, and and it's not to take away from what Malcolm McLean accomplished, because it was quite a lot. So.
Once again, you've been listening to a conversation I had with historian and author Mark Levinson, the author of The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. And we've been discussing the so-called father of containerization and former truck driver, Malcolm McLean. You can find Levinson's book at major booksellers or on Amazon.com. For Landline Now, I'm Mark Redding. One of the issues that's high up on many truckers' lists right now is the idea of requiring speed limiters in trucks. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has had the issue on their agenda for some years now, and not long ago delayed their planned rulemaking until May of 2025. However, the fact remains that this is still on the agenda. Meanwhile, several efforts are underway to try and stop FMCSA from acting on the issue. One involves a standalone bill called the DRIVE Act, H.R. 3039 in the U.S. House and S. 2671 in the Senate. That bill would stop any rule from being issued on the topic. The other attempt to stop FMCSA from acting is contained in the annual transportation spending bill in the U.S. House. It would forbid the FMCSA from spending any money to create a rule for the next fiscal year. However, that provision is not contained in the Senate version of that spending bill. Meanwhile, members of Congress continue to speak out on the issue. That happened during a recent hearing by the U.S. House Subcommittee on Highways. One of the members of Congress at that hearing was U.S. Representative Mike Collins of Georgia. I spoke with him earlier this year about the issue. I wanted to ask you about some of the other big issues in trucking right now while we have you on the line here, Congressman. And probably number one on the minds of a lot of truckers is the move by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to require speed limiters in trucks. What is your view of that issue?
And I think I said this in a hearing not too long ago. We already have speed limiters, Mark. They're called speed limit signs. You see them going up and down every road. And then we have an enforcement called State Patrol and law enforcement, sheriff's office or local police, and they're monitoring that. You don't need speed limiters on trucks. What you need is just what you've got, and that's enforcement of the law. And we have that out there. If I want to limit the speed of my trucks, then I do that. And we do that. Right now, we have the ability to the trucks are set up a whole lot different than what they were 20 and 30 years ago. So we have a lot of control over the torque versus the horsepower. And so you can set a truck up. We can set the limit on it on whatever we want. And we do that more for efficiency and fuel savings, to where the truck can get to where it's going at a safe speed, at a good, at a normal, to save time without being hindered, but yet also give us the efficiency that we need with the fuel economy. So we don't need the government interfering with that side of it. And besides that, we're not the only ones using the roadway. You've got cars out there too. So why are you just limiting to big trucks? I mean, if you're going to do it to everybody. And then where are you going to set it? What's slow enough? 55, 45? Where are you going to stop this? And what's the objective?
That was U.S. Representative Mike Collins of Georgia from a conversation I had with him earlier this year, talking about the effort by FMCSA to create a rule requiring speed limiters in trucks. You can keep up on this issue by going to the website landline.media. Again, that website is landline.media, or listen to future editions of our show. Meanwhile, if you want to speak out on the speed limiter issue, you can call your members of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. The standalone bill that would prevent any rule from being made on the topic is, once again, the DRIVE Act, H.R. 3039 in the U.S. House and S. 2671 in the Senate. And the other attempt to stop FMCSA from acting is contained in the annual transportation spending bill in the U.S. House. It would forbid the FMCSA from spending any money to create a rule for the next fiscal year. To call your members of Congress, just dial 202-224-3121. That's our program for today. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
Capital Reman is your leading source for quality remanufactured engines and components. Capital Reman stands ready to serve all OOIDA members to help reduce costly engine repairs or replacement. Visit capitalreman.com today and use code OOIDA10 to save.
ULSD is hurting your engine. Fight back with Howe's Diesel Defender. Get the most powerful cleaning and maximum lubricity to protect and extend the life of your entire system. At a guaranteed increase in fuel economy, and you can't go wrong with Howe's.
Dispatch, I picked up that load of steel, so I'm ready to roll.
Sounds good. Remember, we're getting paid by weight, so make sure to use a CAT scale.
I wouldn't weigh anywhere else.
Forget misaccuracy when you're truck on a CAT scale.
I'm a dad,
a son,
a husband,
wife.
I'm a writer,
photographer.
I farm.
I'm a veteran.
I love old cars, fishing,
my kids,
chrome, and I am
a
professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us!
Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit OOIDA.com.